Before we took any pictures, I tried to connect with him. I tried to establish a rapport, but he was having his makeup done and then he would get up and he'd go into the bathroom, disappear for a few minutes doing who knows what, and then he'd emerge wide-eyed and be dancing around the studio like a crazy person. The first shoot was for Select, a sort of 90s pop magazine that kind of explored the cultural zeitgeist. And it was at this studio called Click. Checking my diary from the time, I was so busy. I'd done a shoot in the morning, and when I arrived at lunchtime, Robbie seemed a little lost. He was at a tricky point in his career. He was a boy, really. He was only 23. He'd already lived a life. And then, bizarrely, pulled the plug on Take That. He'd gone off, you know, on his own, like Jerry from the Spice Girls, and he'd recorded this album. But it was still to be determined whether his success would continue. You got a sense that the vultures were circling. Before we took any pictures, I tried to connect with him. I tried to establish a rapport, but he was having his makeup done and then he would get up and he'd go into the bathroom, disappear for a few minutes doing who knows what, and then he'd emerge wide-eyed and be dancing around the studio like a crazy person in this big boxy striped suit that the stylist had given him to wear, whilst the anxious PR people were looking on, wondering whether they should intervene. He'd go up to the studio sound system and put the volume up to max. It was a long way from the intimate connection that I try to establish when doing a portrait shoot. As I'm sure have said before, a portrait is a record of the relationship you have with the person on the day. There was no way that I could establish any kind of connection. Although he was twitchy and even slightly disheveled, I mean, he was chain smoking the Marlboros, he was also charismatic and incredibly good looking. He had these mischievous eyes that were sort of full of playful fun. I started out just taking some 35mm because it sort of felt like I was Don McCullin in a war zone or something. It was just, everything was out of my control, so I had to sort of document what was happening. Robbie was just dancing around. And then when things calmed down, when I got something in the bag, I picked up my medium format cameras, which I've talked about in the past. And back then I was using a multitude of different equipment, and I even ended up using this, which is a Linhof Technica 5.4 camera for some of the shots. We shot on daylight, ring flash, tungsten 5.4. That was the 5.4 camera. And at this point, I could start to relax. It had been a crazy start, but I had what I wanted in the bag. I had something for the magazine. I knew they would be happy. I'd sort of ticked all their boxes. And at this point in a shoot, I think, now I'm going to please myself. I have a reservoir of iconic images that are etched into my memory. They're always there, influencing my photographic decisions. And this picture of James Dean in Times Square by Dennis Stock is one such example. I love the anonymity. I wanted to try something similar with Robbie. Get him out into a public setting. Although his management weren't keen for the obvious reasons, Robbie was up for it. So within a blink of an eye, suddenly we're out on the street, walking to Farringdon Tube, including a young Caitlin Moran, the writer, who was interviewing Robbie for the piece. I explained to his entourage that I merely wanted to get a photograph of him on a bench in a public place, perhaps reading a newspaper. But what I really wanted was to get him on the tube. And so as we walked, I told Robbie my plan, and he gave me a little smile of acquiescence. So we're on a platform, the tube train has just come in and the passengers have disembarked, and just as the doors are closing, Robbie and I jump onto the tube train, leaving everybody on the platform. I didn't use any lighting, just available light. I used my Hasselblad and my Fuji 6.7 rangefinder. Both cameras with a tripod, and nobody really batted an eyelid. Now, to do a shoot like that, it would be crazy. You'd probably have to go to Pinewood and hire a pretend tube train and pay a half a dozen or a dozen extras to be in your photograph and get them to sign model release. Back then, you could get away with it. It was kind of guerrilla photography. Now it would be transport for London. You'd probably have to pay a fee. There'd be issues with health and safety. It would just be a maelstrom of problems. We got away with it because we were so brazen. And I think there's a really good life lesson. Just sort of jump right in. Don't ask. Be fleet of foot and brave. Fortune favours the brave, I always say. And basically, if you don't ask, you know, no one can tell you no. I'm sure if I tried to arrange it, it wouldn't happen. And now, all that's left is an interesting picture that would never have been taken if I hadn't taken a risk. So take risks.